Good day, everyone. My name is Rosa Rosa, and today I will be discussing to you the articles 1223, 1224, and 1225. These articles are under the Section 5, which is the divisible and indivisible obligations. So first, let's start with Article 1223. The divisibility or indivisibility of the things that are the object of obligations in which there is only one debtor and only one creditor does not alter or modify the provisions of Chapter 2 of this title. So this article talks about the divisible and indivisible obligations. So let's distinguish what are the difference between these two. Divisible obligation is one of the object in which, in its delivery or performance, is capable of partial fulfillment. So dito, ito yung mga object or performance na pwedeng i-divide or pwedeng installment. So for example, to deliver 200 kilograms of rice. And another example is money. Indivisible obligation is one of the object in which, in its delivery or performance, is not capable of partial fulfillment. So this is the opposite of divisible obligation. Kung yung divisible is capable of partial fulfillment, ito namang indivisible is not. So for example, is to deliver a specific car. So there's a test for distinction kung ang obligation ba is divisible or indivisible. So sabi dito, the controlling circumstance is not the possibility or impossibility of partial prestation, but the purpose of the obligation or the intention of the parties. So sinasabi dito na although yung object or yung thing is physically divisible naman, for example, money, kung ang purpose or intention ng parties is complete performance, ang magiging obligation nito is indivisible. So to fully understand the distinction, let's have an example. Ren agreed to pay Ron 4,000 in 4 equal monthly installments. So this is an example of divisible obligations. Una-una, yung 4,000 is physically divisible. Pangalawa, nag-agreed yung parties na babayaran yung 4,000 in 4 equal monthly installments. But if the agreement is that Ren will pay Ron on a certain date the full amount of 4,000 pesos, the obligation will now become indivisible. So gaya nga ng sabi ko kanina na although yung object is physically divisible naman, pero yung agreement ng parties is to pay on a certain date the full amount, the obligation is magiging indivisible na. So generally, kapag divisible yung object, divisible yung obligations. Pero hindi dapat tayo ma-confuse sa divisibility ng thing or ng object. Sabi nga sa distinction, nakadepende sa intention ng parties kung gusto nila ng complete performance or partial performance. So therefore, kapag divisible yung object and ang intention ng parties is partial performance, the obligation is divisible. Pero kapag divisible yung object and ang intention ng parties is complete performance, the obligation is indivisible. But what if the nature of the object or performance is indivisible? So sabi dito, if the object or performance is not capable of partial fulfillment, the obligation will always be indivisible. Kahit pa yung parties are contrary to it because this is an absolute rule. So therefore, kapag yung object is indivisible from the very beginning, the obligation is indivisible. So there are three kinds of indivisibility. So the first one is legal indivisibility, where specific provisions of law declares as indivisible obligations which by their nature are divisible. So for example na lang nito is taxes. So sinasabi na under the law, taxes should be paid on a certain period of time. Of course, yung pinagbabayad natin sa taxes na ito is money, which is an example of divisible object. Next is conventional indivisibility, where the will of the parties makes us indivisible. Obligations which, by their nature, are divisible. So, under nito yung in-example natin kanina na although yung object is divisible, magiging indivisible yung obligation niya kasi ayun yung kagustuhan ng parties or yun yung intention nila. The last one is natural indivisibility, where the nature of object or prestation does not admit of division. So this object or prestation cannot be divided or hindi pwedeng hati-hatiin. So sabi nga kanina na kapag indivisible yung object or yung prestation, indivisible na rin yung obligation niya. So there are three kinds of division. The first one is qualitative division, or one based on quality, not on number or quantity of the things that are the object of the obligation. So from the word itself, quality, so nakabase siya sa total features or characteristic ng isang bagay. So for example, si Abby and Beng ay tagapagmana and nag-agree sila na i-divide nila yung na-inherit nila na house and lot, rice field, and car. So ang napunta kay Abby ay yung house and lot and yung napunta kay Beng is yung rice field and yung kotse. So next is quantitative division or one based on quantity rather than on quality. So from the word itself, quantity, so nakabase siya sa number or measurement ng isang bagay. So for example, Pedro and Jose divided the 100 kilograms of rice into 2 equal parts. So ibig sabihin, makaka-receive ang bawat isa sa kanila ng 50 kilograms of rice. Last is intellectual division or one which exists only in the minds of the parties. So for example, Maria and Juan are co-owners of a car. So yung car, hindi naman siya physically pwedeng hatiin. And nag-decide na lang yung parties na maghati na lang sa ownership. Now let's proceed to Article 1224. A joint indivisible obligation gives rise to indemnity for damages from the time any one of the debtors does not comply with his undertaking. The debtors who may have been ready to fulfill their promises shall not contribute to the indemnity beyond the corresponding portion of the price of the thing or of the value of the service in which the obligation consists. So basically, this article talks about the effect of non-compliance by a debtor in a joint indivisible obligation. So before we proceed, let's have a recap about joint obligation. So when we say joint obligation, yung performance ng debtor is separate and distinct from other debtors. And since this is a joint indivisible obligation, the liability here is joint. So if one of the joint debtors or some of the joint debtors does not want to comply or refuse to comply with their obligation, the obligation will be converted into payment for damages. And sabi pa dito, the creditor cannot ask for specific performance or rescission because wala namang cause of action with regards to other debtors na willing mag-fulfill ng kanilang obligation. And since joint indivisible obligation to, yung other joint debtors na hindi liable ay hindi na dapat mag-contribute beyond their share of obligation. Now let's proceed with our last article for today, Article 1225. For the purpose of the preceding articles, obligations to give definite things and those which are not susceptible of partial performance shall be deemed to be indivisible. When the obligation has for its object the execution of a certain number of days of work, the accomplishment of work by metrical units, or analogous things which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance, it shall be divisible. However, even though the object or service may be physically divisible, an obligation is indivisible if so provided by law or intended by the parties. In obligations not to do, divisibility or indivisibility shall be determined by the character of the prestation in each particular case. So this article talks about the general rule in determining whether an obligation is divisible or indivisible. So there are 4 instances wherein an obligation is deemed to be indivisible. First is obligations to give definite things. So kapag yung thing or yung object is definite, indivisible lagi yan. So for example, is to give a specific bicycle. Another is to give a particular electric fan. Second, obligations which are not susceptible of partial performance. So for example, to dance a cariñosa or to sing a song. Indivisible obligation siya kasi nire-require nito na i-perform lahat ng parts. Third, obligations provided by law to be indivisible even if thing or service is physically divisible. For example, under the law, taxes should be paid within a definite period. So ito yung sinasabi sa legal indivisibility na kapag law yung nag-provide, magiging indivisible siya kahit na physically divisible naman yung object. The last one is obligations intended by the parties to be indivisible even if thing or service is physically divisible. For example, the obligation of Robert to give 1,000 pesos to Anna on a certain date. So ito rin yung sinasabi sa conventional indivisibility na magiging indivisible yung obligation kapag ang intention ng parties is complete performance although yung thing or yung service or yung object is physically divisible. So there are 3 instances naman if an obligation is deemed divisible. First, obligations which have for their object the execution of a certain number of days of work. For example, the obligation of A is to paint this house. It is to be finished in 5 days. So masasabi natin na divisible obligation siya because it requires several days for the obligation to be fulfilled. Second, obligations which have for their object the accomplishment of work by metrical units. For example, the obligation of Y is to make a table for X in 3 feet wide and 5 feet long. The last one is obligations which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance. For example, the obligation of G is to teach chemistry in a university for 1 year. In obligation not to do, negative indivisible obligation should be fulfilled continuously during a certain period. So for example, X obliged himself not to sell cigarettes in his store for 1 year. So in a span of 1 year, hindi dapat siya magbenta ng cigarettes sa kanyang store and dapat continuous yung pag-fulfill ng kanyang obligation. But if X obliged himself not to sell cigarettes only during Sundays, the obligation will now become divisible. And that is all for my report. Thank you so much for listening and have a good day.